What are primitive reflexes? In this episode, we're going to talk about all about primitive reflexes and what they are. Welcome to the episode, and thank you for joining me here at Reflex Integration Through Play. I am Coca McDonald, an occupational therapist and the founder of Reflex Integration Through Play program and the author to Integrating Primitive Reflexes Through Play and Exercise book series. Primitive reflexes are these reflex patterns that are present when we're in utero, and sometimes some of them emerge after birth or during birth. These reflex patterns are innate and don't go through the conscious brain, but go through the brainstem level, meaning that we do not control them, and they're there for survival reasons. The way they work is when the body is triggered with some kind of sensory trigger or input, the body will respond a certain way. There's a sensory trigger to the body, and there is a motor or physical response from the body. Our body is covered with different triggers. It can be head turning, it can be movement, it can be by touch, it can be triggered by sound, or it can be triggered by sight. So any kind of sensory trigger that can create this response. These are reflex patterns in our body, and we do need them. And babies need them to survive. That is why babies survive. When the baby needs help, for instance, when they're in distress, they will cry and the mom will come. That can be part of the Moro reflex, for instance. And the mom will come and responds to the child, or the dad or the caregiver. They respond to the child, and the baby feels comforted, and the baby starts to feel, oh, the world is safe. Now I can regulate myself. The best way to think of it is each reflex pattern has a sensory trigger and a motor response or a physical response. That means when infants are born, they're born with multiple reflex patterns and reflex responses in their body. Think of our body as coded, if you want to use computer term, with these codes. Let's say the sensory trigger would be the input you're putting in the computer, and the motor response would be the output, what you're going to get from a computer. So you code something, you type something to your computer, and it spits out an answer. Reflexes work exactly the same. They're a specific sensory trigger to the body, and the body will respond a certain way. Now, the problem becomes when you put the sensory input, you give the sensory input to the body, and the body's not responding. And sometimes another difficulty with the body can be you give the sensory input and wrong response is coming. Now, that is what therapists need to specialize in and make their clinical reasoning and observation a lot more sharper. For instance, with the Moro reflex, it's the feeling of a sudden falling, can be the head going backwards. That can create the feeling of the Moro reflex sensory trigger. And the child will cry. There's a full extension, the body, and then there's a hold piece of it. And then right away, there's a second phase while the baby goes into a flexed position, and then they'll cry and they'll be distressed. And then the heart rate will go down, baby feels comforted, and the cycle goes on. And the baby starts to feel that the world is safe. He can ask for their need, and their needs are met. That's just one part of that reflex. Another one can be you're stroking the cheek of the baby, and then the baby will open their mouth and turn towards that stroke, and then that helps with breastfeeding. And then if you put your hand in the palm of the baby, and the baby will grasp that hand, and it's super strong, and that's a Palmar grasp. There's so many reflex patterns in our body. And the baby needs that, the infant needs that to survive. Without the second swallow reflex, without the Moro reflex to take the first breath when the baby's born, without the spinal gland to be able to crawl and to scoot and then pee, without all that, babies would not be able to survive. So it is really, really crucial for these reflex patterns to be present in the child. Nature is so beautiful that it's given us this power to respond to all these sensory triggers. Because how else can the baby respond to the world? The baby needs to learn to feed. Imagine if you actually have to consciously teach the baby to feed. That's not going to be helpful. So nature had it that when you stroke the mouth will open. When you put something in the mouth, they naturally just suck and swallow. That's just the system is already there. That is the reflex pattern. If you stroke them a certain way, they will turn towards you. If you stroke in their lower back, they will be able to relax and pee. They're necessary for them to do that. When they're distressed, there's a system that makes them cry out for their caregiver. So the caregiver will come and attend to them. That's part of the Moro reflex work. And all those reflex patterns come together to help the baby survive. Even in the birthing process, there's so many reflex patterns that come together for the baby to born a natural way, a natural, healthy way. If you put a baby, like the infant who's just born and prone on their tummy, you see that they even start to like do an army crawl and move. If you put the infant right on the mom's belly, you'll see them army crawl and searching for food and get to the point of even start to suck and start to breastfeed. It's amazing. And it's a nature's way of taking care of the baby. And it's necessary for infants to have it. It's really, really beautiful. I get really fascinated about how nature is put together and how we can use it in our treatment. And why I even love focusing on reflex pattern to help us start out a treatment plan that really helps us understand how the body moves. For those of you who start learning about it, especially if you're a therapist and you start treatment planning, it's so fun and even easy to create treatment plans because now not only you're working on functional skills later on, but you really start to understand the movement and the early side of movement. And this is very important. It's a natural progression. All the infants should go through it. And then if we don't see that in the early stages when these reflexes should have been really visible and apparent for us to test and see, that tells us there is something wrong with this specific baby and we should really address it. Unfortunately, in that age, we miss a lot. Babies, you don't expect them to do much. Parents are not trained and doctors don't know much about it either. So it makes it really, really difficult to assess everything. There are a few reflexes that doctors usually test, one of them being the Palmar grasp, and they also test for the Moro reflex to see if they have the startle reflex. So those are the ones they usually look for. But after that is considered, everything goes dormant and we don't have to worry about it. But what we know now, the more we're working with kids and what we're learning now is these reflex patterns might be still activated and still firing and not become dormant yet. Now, let's talk about that a little bit. So first I said the reflexes have a sensory trigger and the motor response. Imagine that for every child to learn, those needs to be present. There are multiple reflexes, but in order for the child to understand the world and to respond to it, these reflex patterns need to be present. So what happens? Every time the child, something touches his hand, he grasps it, and then his body will register, okay, something is in my hand. And then, okay, what is it now? Texture, I'm learning. So the brain is learning. The brain is, the minute the baby is born and moving, integration is happening. It's not a lean process. It's really a dynamic process. When you think about reflex integration, think about a dynamic process as part of a sensory integration. It's not a standalone process. It's not just a motor response. There's a cognitive piece of it as well. A lot is happening in the baby's brain. They're putting it together. There's myelination. There's coordination. There's right and left side coordination, front and back. The baby's learning and processing all these sensory information the body's getting and putting it together. Integration is happening. That's why babies should be encouraged to move a lot and have these free areas for them to test textures and roll around and move a lot. So this is how they integrate in a natural environment. Later on, what will happen, these reflex patterns will start become more dormant. So now the baby goes from moving very reflexively, uncontrolled, meaning these patterns, the primitive reflexes go only through the brainstem. not the conscious part of the brain. It's like a knee jerk. So you can't control a knee jerk. It's going to happen. That's how the primitive reflexes are. But later on, as the baby matures and grows, and there's a lot of myelination, exploration, and growth, what will happen? More controlled movement patterns start to take over. So now the child is not fully controlled by these reflex patterns. They are a building block, but they're the bottom now. Now the child starts to control movement intentionally. Now when the child grabs an object, he can or she can let it go. But if the reflex is too strong with certain reflex pattern like cerebral palsy or brain damage, you can see that they have a hard time even opening it because their reflex is super strong. When the baby starts to grow and they have more mobility, more control, it starts to go into more conscious brain, the brain develops. That's what we want to see with some of these reflex patterns. When they stay active, some of them are mild in a sense that you won't see it, but you have to be skilled in this work to be able to start assess it. What it starts to do is it starts to affect the next level of development. Other motor skills will be affected, emotional regulation will be affected, sensory regulation will be affected, visual perception, visual skills will be affected, and learning and just everything else on top of it will be affected. When we are working with reflex patterns, we first, when they're infants and babies, we want to see them. What you want to see is like, if I'm triggering this sensory trigger, I need to be able to see this motor response. That's one. So I want to see for the correct, this is trigger A, need to give me trigger A's motor response. Sometimes what will happen is we trigger a sensory with the infant, especially when you're testing, and you see zero response. That's a problem. Or another problem you see is you trigger the reflex and you see the wrong movement pattern. And now that's another problem too. So that's something that the therapist can be able to go back and work on if that's the case. It's the same as like if I come to my office, I turn on the light, I want the light in the office to turn on, not the kitchen. But when you're having that pathway crossed, then you have to be able to go and work on it because each reflex pattern and work together to help build the next level of development. They don't work alone. They work in conjunction with one another. Some of them actually work almost opposite to one another to help one another develop. The same way, like you have a flexor muscle and then your extender muscle, there's some reflex pattern, they go an opposite direction of one another so that the child can not only move one way, but in both directions. And then together, they can facilitate one another, they can support one another so the child can develop. The older the child gets and the child is having a hard time sitting still and focusing, coordinating, playing in sports, and not being able to just understand what's going on with the body, fine motor, handwriting challenges, and all these things, usually we focus more on the functional and the challenge that they're having. Of course, we should, and we should be working on that. But when you're creating a treatment plan, you also want to understand what is like the foundational level I can go back and start working on and then be able to get to the next step instead of overwhelm the child. Let's say you have a 7-year-old child in the classroom can be able to function in a way that the rest of the class are functioning because can keep up with the class, can copy from the board, or the speed is slow, or the fine motor is difficult, can't participate in a sport because can't catch or coordinate himself or herself to cooperate in this game. There's so many challenges this child may have. When you're treatment planning, you can get to the point of creating a baseline. Once you screen, understanding a good baseline, and being able to set up a plan that walks the child through the developmental progression. Understand the functional skill that the child is working on, why the child is having that difficulty, screen for reflex retention. If you see any reflex retention, then put together a plan that really helps that integration process by working on the specific functional goal that you're working on. Again, that is not the only thing you're going to do because the body's not just responding to motor response, there's also physical cognitive response as well. So you have to also address everything else surrounding it. But when you're focusing on just the motor response piece of it, and then you can start creating a treatment plan accordingly. I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions, make sure that you comment below and also tag me in social media if you're following us in social media, and make sure that you ask your questions. I hope this is helpful and giving you a good idea of what reflex integration and what primitive reflexes are.